Imagine this scenario. An investigation starts, looking into a company's affairs, but then, well, the lines get blurred. Information gathered for one reason suddenly becomes key evidence in a criminal case against individuals.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of complex situation that played out in Hong Kong starting in the late 90s, early 2000s.
It's a really fascinating story. It involves a big corporate investigation, serious fraud allegations involving a company called the United Group Limited and, its subsidiaries, AGL, ATWL, and APL.
And it all leads to this major legal battle, essentially questioning the very idea of what constitutes a fair trial.
Welcome to this deep dive.
So today we're really getting into the weeds of this significant Hong Kong legal case. We're focusing on that big investigation into the United Group and those related companies.
Think of this as your shortcut to understanding the core issues here. Specifically, how did that company investigation end up intersecting with a criminal case against two key people? We're calling them Mr. Ush and Mr. Enche for this discussion.
Right. And why this matters, really, is that it digs into some fundamental questions, about how our legal systems work. That balance between finding out the truth about potential wrongdoing and protecting the rights of the people involved.
Exactly. And look, we promise not to drown you in dense legal speak. Our mission here is simple. Understand why that lower court initially decided to completely stop the criminal case. What were the key legal ideas in play?
We're really unpacking that tension, that conflict between the investigation phase and the later prosecution phase.
So just to set the stage, our discussion is mainly based on a really important judgment from Hong Kong's highest court, the Court of Final Appeal, back in 2001.
Yeah, and that judgment looked at and actually ended up overturning an earlier decision which had put a permanent stop, a permanent stay on the criminal case against Mr. Uth and Mr. Rowe.
And these weren't minor players. Mr. Liu was chairman and director at AGL and APL, also a director at ATWL.
And Mr. Yu was a director and the financial controller at AGL, so pretty senior figures within this United Group structure.
Okay, so let's start there. The big question. Why did that lower court judge, Judge Hugh, decide to hit the brakes so hard on prosecuting Mr. Wu and Mr. Madel? What was the argument?
Well, the allegations themselves were pretty heavy. Both men were facing 2 counts of conspiracy to defraud and 4 counts of publishing false accounting statements. So serious financial charges.
And these related to specific deals?
Yes. 4 separate transactions back in 1990 and 1991. These involved issuing and placing really large amounts of shares in AGL, ATWL, and APL.
All listed companies on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
That's right. All part of this United Group, with AGL being the parent company.
So the prosecution's angle was what? That the public was fooled?
Essentially, yes. They argued that the public, the investors, were deliberately led to believe these share placements were about raising real capital from independent sources, legitimate business deals.
But the reality, according to the prosecution, was different.
Very different, they claimed. They said only a tiny bit of the money raised actually went to the companies issuing the shares.
So where did the shares go?
The prosecution alleged that other companies within the United Group got hold of these shares without paying for them.
How?
Through, well, what they called deceptive banking arrangements. And they claimed Mr. Eth and Mr. Dunelli were behind it all.
So a major discrepancy between what was presented publicly and what was allegedly happening behind the scenes.
Exactly. That was the core of the prosecution's case.
Now, these criminal charges didn't just appear out of thin air, did they? There was an earlier investigation.
Correct. Before any arrests, the regulators were already looking into the United Group's finances. The financial secretary appointed an inspector, a Mr. Duno.
And his job was?
To conduct a deep dive investigation into the United Group's affairs, specifically including those 4 transactions we just mentioned.
So the very things that became the basis for the criminal charges.
Precisely. And this investigation wasn't just routine. It came after a formal complaint and an initial probe by the Securities and Futures Commission, the SFC.
Right. And there was oversight.
Yes, a steering committee was set up. It was chaired by Mr. Greet, who was the Deputy Secretary for Financial Affairs, acting for the Financial Secretary. And it had people from the legal department and the SFC on it, too.
Okay, this is interesting. Was there an awareness early on that this company investigation might lead somewhere else, like to criminal charges?
Absolutely. That was recognized pretty much from the get-go.
So the police knew about it?
Yes, the police were kept informed about the inspector's progress all along. This really highlights that that tricky interface between regulatory probes and criminal law enforcement.
So what was the inspector, Mr. Dude, actually looking for? What was his brief?
It was pretty wide-ranging. He had to scrutinize any United Group transactions over 10 million Hong Kong dollars going back to early 1990.
That covers a lot of ground.
It did. Asset sales, loans, financing deals, share dealings across a whole network of related companies within the group.
Was it just about the numbers, or was there more to it?
More than just the numbers. He also had to figure out if these deals were done in good faith. Were they genuine arm's-length transactions in the normal course of business?
And
Crucially, his terms of reference explicitly told him to gather evidence that could be used in court, either criminal or civil court, if he found signs of fraud or other offenses.
So that link to potential criminal proceedings was baked in from the start. That seems really important.
It's a key detail, definitely.
Okay, so let's jump forward. Mr. Ah and Mr. Oyeniyam are now facing these criminal charges. And the High Court judge, Judge He, makes this huge decision, a permanent stay.
Yeah, permanent stay, which, effectively kills the prosecution. It's not just a pause.
And his reasons were tied directly back to that earlier investigation by Mr. Aya.
Exactly. He gave two main reasons, and both link the company investigation to the attempt to prosecute these two men. This is where that central conflict really sharpens.
Okay, what was reason number one?
Reason one was all about abuse of power and violating the defendant's rights. Judge Heen found that the inspector, Mr. Wu, had handed over information and documents he got during his investigation.
Information possibly obtained under compulsion, right? Because it was a statutory investigation.
Potentially, yes. Handed it over directly to the police and the prosecution to help them build the criminal case.
And the judge thought that was wrong.
He ruled it was an abuse of the inspector's legal powers. He said it went beyond what the law intended for those powers. And critically, he felt it violated the rights of Mr. Yu and Mr. Police.
So continuing the prosecution after that would be
an abuse of the court's own process, in his view. Unacceptable.
Okay, that's a strong stance. What was the second reason?
The second reason involved those judicial review applications. Remember, Mr. Yu and Mr. News had challenged the investigation itself in court. During those proceedings, some documents a religious affirmation and some letters were submitted for the inspector and the financial secretary. Judge Shinu decided this submission contained misleading information.
Misleading in a way that could harm the defendants.
Yes, potentially incriminating information that he found misleading. He saw this as another major problem, contributing to his decision that the whole process was tainted.
Was there anything else brought up in that lower court?
There was a third point raised, yeah, about delays in getting to trial and also concerns over Mr. Tu's health.
But the judge didn't buy that one.
No, Judge Sheen rejected that argument, and it wasn't really part of the appeal later on. So the core issues for him were really that improper use of investigation material and the misleading info during the judicial review.
Okay, so a lower court judge stops a major prosecution dead. That's obviously not going to be the end of the story.
No, definitely not. The Secretary for Justice, representing the prosecution, appealed Judge Shee's decision. They took it up to the Court of Final Appeal, Hong Kong's top court.
And the top court agreed to hear it.
Yes, they granted leave to appeal. And importantly, they pinpointed several key legal questions that needed answering. Not just technicalities, but fundamental points of law with really broad significance.
What kind of questions were they looking at?
Well, first, they wanted clarity on just how far the inspectors and the financial secretary's powers went when it came to sharing investigation info with prosecutors. Was that allowed?
And the self-incrimination issue must have been central, too.
Absolutely. They looked hard at the privilege against self-incrimination in this specific context, including this idea of derivative use immunity.
Can you explain that again quickly? Derivative use?
Sure. So direct use immunity means the actual compelled answers can't be used against you in court. Derivative use immunity would go further. It would mean any other evidence the police found because of those compelled answers also couldn't be used. Like a fruit of the poison tree kind of idea.
Got it. What else was on the table for the appeal court?
They also had to consider evidence the police got using search warrants. If the warrants were based on information that came from the inspector, could that evidence still be used?
Tricky.
Very. And then there was the broader question. Do courts even have the power to stop a prosecution just because they think the authorities abuse their power? And if so, When is it appropriate?
A big question about judicial oversight of the executive.
Exactly. And finally, they tackle the impact of that inspector's report being made public.
Right. The report containing potentially damaging stuff about Mr. Ut and Mr. Choin being out there while a criminal case was brewing.
Yeah, did that publication happening alongside police searches make a fair trial impossible? How do you balance public information with the right to a fair hearing? These were the heavy questions the Court of Final Appeal had to wrestle with.
Okay, so how did the Court of Final Appeal unravel all of this? What was their reasoning?
Well, they took it point by point. First, on the inspector's role, they clarified something important. When Mr. Ju shared information with the police, he wasn't acting rogue.
He was acting under direction.
Yes, under the direction of the financial secretary, working through that steering committee, specifically via Mr. Chains, they used something called the Carltona principle.
Which basically says,
It's an administrative law idea that allows government ministers to effectively delegate their functions to officials in their department. So, the court saw the inspector's actions as legitimate actions of the financial secretary's office.
okay, so that addresses the abuse of power point from the lower court. What about the purpose of the investigation itself?
The court looked closely at the Companies Ordinance, the law governing these investigations. They examined the relevant sections like 143, 145, and so on.
To see if sharing info for prosecution fit the bill.
Exactly, and their conclusion was yes, it did. They found parts of the law that clearly anticipated that criminal proceedings might actually result from these investigations.
So the law itself suggested this kind of information sharing was okay.
That was the Court of Final Appeal's interpretation, yes, directly contradicting Judge Xu's view.
Now, the really thorny one, self-incrimination. How do they handle that?
They did a very careful analysis of Section 145(3)(a) of the Companies Ordinance. That's the bit that takes away the right to silence during the investigation.
But give something back.
Right, it gives that direct use immunity. Your compelled answers can't be used as evidence against you in a later criminal trial, barring some exceptions not relevant here.
Okay, but what about the derivative use? The evidence found because of the answers.
This was a crucial point. The Court of Final Appeal rejected the idea that there was some separate, broader common law derivative use immunity floating around that applied here.
So if the law itself didn't grant derivative use immunity, it didn't exist in this context.
Essentially, yes. They said the specific protection was the direct use immunity spelled out in the ordinance, and that was it. They pointed to an Australian case, Hamilton v. Odes, to back this up, and said the Sorby case the lower court relied on was different.
That's a major departure from the lower court's reasoning.
A very significant one.
What about the human rights arguments? The Hong Kong Bill of Rights protection against self-incrimination.
The court addressed that too. They looked at Article 11(2)(g), which protects you from being forced to testify against yourself in a criminal trial.
But the investigation wasn't a trial.
Exactly. The court said that protection didn't kick in during the company investigation phase because Mr. Hutu and Mr. No hadn't actually been charged with a crime yet. At that stage, the company's ordinance, with its limited immunity, was what governed the situation.
Okay, so what about the overall fairness, the abuse of process argument?
The court acknowledged that, yes, courts do have an inherent power to stay proceedings for abuse of process. It's a fundamental safeguard.
Right.
But, they stressed, it's a power to be used very, very sparingly. Only when a fair trial is truly impossible, or when the prosecution's conduct is so bad it fundamentally shocks the conscience of the court.
And they didn't think this case reached that level.
No. They disagreed with Judge Xu that simply sharing the information automatically made a fair trial impossible here.
And the public report. The potential prejudice from that.
They acknowledged it was a concern. The timing of the redacted report's release alongside police searches wasn't ideal.
But not fatal to the case.
Not fatal in their view. They basically said that potential prejudice is something that trial judges deal with all the time. It could be managed through things like careful jury selection, clear instructions from the judge, telling the jury what they can and can't consider, and so on.
So they saw it as a manageable trial issue, not a reason to stop the whole thing.
And that seems to be the conclusion they reached, yes.
So after weighing all that up, the inspector's powers, the law's intent, self-incrimination, fairness, what was the final verdict from the Court of Final Appeal?
The final verdict was clear. They overturned Judge Xi's decision. They lifted the permanent stay on the criminal proceedings against Mr. Eus and Mr. Essen.
Meaning the prosecution could go ahead.
Yes. They concluded that the reasons the lower court gave just weren't strong enough to justify the drastic step of halting the entire prosecution.
Wow. So pulling this all together, what are the big takeaways for us, for you listening?
Well, I think first off, this case really throws that tension into sharp relief, doesn't it? The tension between needing to investigate complex corporate stuff thoroughly, potentially uncovering wrongdoing.
And protecting the basic legal rights of the individuals who might end up in the crosshairs because of that investigation. It's a real balancing act.
Definitely. And it also shows very clearly how specific laws, statutes like the Companies Ordinance here can actually change or limit traditional common law rights, like the right to remain silent.
But often with built-in safeguards, like that direct use immunity we talked about. It's not always a complete removal of rights.
That's a good point. The limits often have their own limits.
This case also makes you think hard about how information flows, right?
Mm.
When is it okay for information gathered for regulatory purposes to be used to build a criminal case? Where's the line?
Yeah, it raises really important questions about potential overreach and what checks and balances are needed to keep things fair when regulatory bodies and prosecutors work closely together.
And I guess the final point is how reluctant the highest court was to stop the prosecution entirely based on abuse of process.
Exactly. It reinforces that stopping a criminal case before trial is a really exceptional measure. The courts prefer to let the trial process itself handle potential fairness issues if possible. The bar for a permanent stay is set very high.
So this whole saga leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on, doesn't it?
I think so. In today's world, with more regulation, more scrutiny of corporations, how do we strike that right balance?
How do we ensure the public interest in finding truth and holding people accountable is served?
Without trampling on the fundamental rights of those being investigated. What safeguards really work when these powerful investigative and prosecutorial forces intersect? It's not easy.
It really isn't. And this deep dive into the United Group case, I think, perfectly highlights that complex dance between corporate rules, criminal justice, and basic legal rights.
It's a powerful case study in the complexities of seeking justice, especially when dealing with intricate financial investigations.
We really hope this discussion has given you food for thought. Maybe think about how these issues play out in different places, different legal systems. What do you think about this balance? We'd genuinely love to hear your perspectives or any other questions this raised for you.
Indeed. And that wraps up another deep dive from us. We hope exploring this case and the principles involved has been insightful for you.
Join us next time as we tackle another complex and hopefully equally thought-provoking topic. Until then, keep exploring.